let's read some excerpts. So I'll start by reading the first excerpt, which I have read, or at least I have shared before in print form on a few of the blogs, and I have listed on my website for people to read, which is our introduction to Margaret. And I'll just read you the first little bit here, and then we'll go on and see the introductions to the other three main characters. Okay, so this is chapter 1, June 30th, 1865, San Francisco. A girl's terrified scream jerked Margaret Foster's attention from the mathematics formula she'd been rehearsing in her mind. A chill shivered up her spine as she searched the wooden sidewalks and fog-shrouded buildings lining the cobblestone intersection. To her left, tidy storefronts bore crowded window displays and closed doors, not yet open for the day's business. To her right, a rough-looking haberdashery was flanked by windowless buildings with faded lettering. She squinted at the sign just beyond the men's clothing shop. Melodeon. She stepped away. Not another person in sight. Who had screamed? The sound had been distant. Could she have mistaken a cat's cry for a scream? The woman who owned the boarding house Margaret had checked into yesterday had said to turn south at the milliner's shop with a large glass display window. No such building met her gaze. She kicked at a loose pebble and started back the way she'd come. Knowing your lessons won't matter at all if you're late, and another scream spun Margaret toward the windowless buildings. Through the haze, she spotted a small figure chased by a larger one. Her heart squeezed. That child was in danger. The pair disappeared into the mist beyond the Melodeon. Margaret dashed after them. Human-like shadows flickered in and out of view as she ran through the gloom. Down alleys and up streets, she followed their echoing footsteps. A stitch formed in her side, but she pressed on. That child needed her help. Then they vanished into thickening clouds and did not reappear. That's all I'm going to read. You'll have to get the book to know what happens next. I know, us authors are so sneaky. Let's see. Flip to our introduction to the Everett. Okay. Everett Thompson brushed crumbs from his beard with one hand, and with the other took a second biscuit from the tray that had been delivered by Dennis O'Neill's maid. The little red-haired woman had been so quiet, Everett might not have noticed her at all, had the tantalizing smell of warm bread not wafted toward him upon her entrance. After depositing the tray of baked goods with a bowl of jam and a pot of tea, she'd slipped from Dennis's office just as silently as she'd come. Everett sneaked a glance at the older man seated across the tea table. In this city born from the pit of corruption, Dennis represented one of only a handful of wealthy men whom Everett knew to be trustworthy. He was especially wary of those in San Francisco, where the greediest men from around the world had gathered to increase their worth on the backs of those less fortunate. Which was why he'd left this cesspool and settled in San Diego nearly 15 years ago. Unfortunately, the funds Everett needed to expand his dry goods store were not to be had in his beautiful yet still small city. He'd been blessed to learn of Dennis's reputation for fair, honest, and forthright dealings. The information had encouraged Everett to approach him about a loan last fall. However, he'd not anticipated this unfortunate turn of events. He wasn't sure how Dennis would handle it, and the rigidity of Dennis's shoulders as he sipped his tea did not bode well. Everett sliced his pastry in half and slathered a generous portion of jam across the insides. I appreciate the refreshments. It was a long journey from San Diego, and you rightly guessed I'd be famished. He slapped his two halves together. These biscuits are perfection. Everett took a large bite. The airy dough melted on his tongue. If it wouldn't endanger a valued business relationship, he'd be tempted to talk the young maid into traveling to San Diego. The Franklin Hotel might offer fine cuisine, but more than a few other San Diego businesses could do with an improvement in that department. Convincing the right men to invest in their fair city would be a far sight easier after pleasing their palates. He swallowed the delicious bite. All in good time. Shall I assume your new maid is doing well, then? Dennis frowned. If you must know, those biscuits are from the restaurant down the street. Miss Mysdale couldn't bake a cracker without burning it. She's even worse at cleaning house. Why keep her on? Everett didn't actually care whether the girl was good at her job or not. Right now, he'd say anything, ask any question, to avoid discussing the true reason Dennis had requested to meet with him. The businessman had kept to pleasantries since Everett stepped through the door 20 minutes ago, but it wouldn't last much longer. Delaying the conversation wouldn't change what Everett must say. Nevertheless, some part of him must be holding out for an angelic intervention, because he couldn't seem to stop himself from continuing the distracting conversation. Last I heard, there are plenty of women seeking domestic work in this city. Surely it wouldn't be difficult to find a replacement. Dennis removed his spectacles to rub his temples. Believe me, I've considered it. She's quiet, kind, compliant, and goes out of her way to set my newspapers exactly within reach before I come to breakfast. She's even removed stains from clothes I was convinced were ruined. But her flightiness outweighs it all. I'd have fired her weeks ago if I had the time to hire a new one. He slipped his spectacles back on. But that isn't what we're here to discuss. Everett's last bite of biscuit caught in his throat. He coughed so hard and long, his eyes watered, and Dennis handed him a cup of tea. Grateful, Everett poured the soothing liquid down his throat. The instant the last drop was gone, he regretted his haste. With nothing else to do, he returned the cup to the table. How embarrassing. My apologies. He dabbed at his mouth with a napkin. He dabbed at his mouth with a napkin before setting it down and facing the man who held Everett's future in his hands. Everett refused to grimace. It would reveal too much. What were we speaking of? Your loan payments are past due, Everett. Several months past due, and my patience has run out. And that's where we will leave Everett for now. Okay, so now I'm going to read a scene with Fletcher and Katie. I can't read you their very first scenes because those would give away some spoilers. But this scene where they get to have their first real conversation together, I think is pretty fun, and I hope you enjoy it. But I am not promising I am doing Katie's dialect any service whatsoever. I am not a voice actor, so please have a little grace with me. Not sure how much of her accent I'm actually going to try to attempt. We will see. Oh, and this scene is from Fletcher's point of view. A few minutes later, he turned down the alley beside O'Neill's home and business. Katie stood in the tiny backyard beating a rug. The cotton scarf she tied over her red hair did nothing to protect her face, which was so coated in dust and sweat her freckles couldn't be seen. So intense was her concentration, she hadn't yet noticed him. He pulled his hat from his head and tiptoed into the yard until he stood just a foot behind her. Hey there, beautiful. Katie gasped and whirled. He easily ducked her swinging baton and laughed. You ought to pay more attention to your surroundings. And thee'd better stand back before I take another swing at thee. Her unusual accent thickened when she was irritated. When he'd first met her, he'd guessed she was of Scottish descent. So similar was the sound of her speech. But when he asked her about it, she said only that her family came from a small town in northern England, not Scotland. Her tone had made clear no further questions were welcome. That suited Fletcher just fine, since he wasn't interested in the kind of friendship that included rooting through each other's pasts. In fact, his only interest in the petite Spitfire lay in keeping her safe on behalf of his cousin. Of course, that didn't mean he couldn't have a little fun while he was at it. Still grinning, he raised both hands and took a dutiful step back. Happy? Her gray-blue eyes flashed, but she didn't carry through her threat. I'd ask what thee are doing here, but I know perfectly well why thee've come, she sniffed. Thee can tell your cousin I'm right as rain. Now be off, before Mr. O'Neill sees thee. She pivoted and resumed beating the rug. He frowned. She usually responded to his teasing with a laugh and a pretty smile. Ah, Katie, don't be like that. I'm sorry I scared you, all right? Thee are forgiven. Her swings didn't lose their rhythm. Something else must be bothering her. He stepped to the side for a better view of her face. What's wrong? She glanced at him, but kept swinging. 'Tis nothing for thee to worry about. Fletcher cocked his head. Worrying about you is my job. Clorinda said so. But if you won't tell me what it is, I won't know how much to worry. Should I be—" He made a face of exaggerated contemplation. "Or ought I to be—" He widened his eyes with mock terror and pretended to chew all his fingernails at once. A short laugh escaped the flushed woman, and she finally stopped beating the poor rug. "They're a pest, Fletcher Johnson." He waggled his eyebrows. "But a handsome one." "Aye, and thee know it too well," she sighed. "If thee must know, Mr. O'Neill is put out with me for letting a cat into his house this morning." "Why'd you do a thing like that?" "I didn't mean to. It stole in the door while I was carrying out a rug, and made a great racket while Mr. O'Neill was in a meeting. Many of his things were broken. I've never seen him so angry." Fletcher looked from the baton in her hand to the rug, to the back door of Mr. O'Neill's residence. "But he didn't fire you?" "No, thank the blessed Lord. But he says he will if anything more happens." She squared her shoulders and jabbed the baton at him. "Which is why thee need to leave, and I need to get back to me work." Fletcher snagged the end of the baton before she could start swinging again. "I have a better idea. Why don't I write you a couple of letters of reference so you can find another position? One that pays more than the pittance I know you're getting here." She hadn't actually confessed how little O'Neill was paying her. She refused to even tell him where she lived. But Fletcher could see with his own eyes how worn her clothes were and how much weight she'd lost in the months since coming to work for O'Neill. Last night, one of the men at Fletcher's table had mentioned his wife was searching for a new lady's maid. The man complained that his wife was too lenient with her maids and too soft-hearted when it came to hiring new help. So he planned to do the hiring this time. He went on and on about what he planned to demand of the new hire, and Fletcher had paid close attention. He was certain he could write a reference that would secure Katie the job. Once through the interview, Katie would be working for the wife, and, from the sounds of it, the mistress was too kind to fire Katie for her daydreaming. The pay would be good, too. If he could convince Katie to go along with the plan— "No," Katie tugged the baton free. "I know everything turned out well for Clorinda, and thee mean well, but lying is wrong. I'll not be a part of it." "Are you saying you didn't do your best to serve your former employers well?" "Of course I did me best." "Then the letters wouldn't be a lie." She gave him a knowing look. "They'll be signing your own name at the bottom then." He ran his hand through his hair. "Of course not. No one wants a reference letter from a card dealer." "Then it'll be a lie." She resumed beating the rug. "Fine." He crammed his hat back on his head. She'd have to see reason once she lost her position here. And she would lose it. Katie Mysdale was honest, kind, and the hardest worker he knew. But her tendency to daydream had cost her more jobs over the past 7 years than he had fingers and toes. No one would recommend her. She'd confessed that even the Ladies' Aid Society had finally turned her away. She was running out of options. So there you have it, 3 excerpts from Harmony on the Horizon. If you haven't picked up your copy, please go and get it. And if you have, please leave a review. And I love reader mail. So if you want to send me a note and let me know what you thought, I'd be thrilled. My email is write, W-R-I-T-E, Kathleen Denly @gmail.com. And you can find a link for that on my website. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a wonderful day.